Welcome to Hope and Heresy, Life on the Religious Left, where we wrestle with contemporary issues using history and theology as our guides.
Our task is to reclaim religion for everyday people who want to live meaningfully without letting arbitrary doctrine or oppressive religious practice prevent us from asking big questions about our complicated world. I'm Reverend Sarah Lindsay.
And I'm Reverend Peggy Clark, and we're Unitarian Universalist ministers broadcasting from Community Church of New York, here in New York City. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Peggy.
Episode 2, Season 3.
Episode 2, Season 3. And we are, as we talked about last week, centering this whole season around the divine and sort of different ways of thinking about the divine, different aspects of the divine. And last week we talked about the divine and love. And this week, I'm going to go ahead and say we're talking about the opposite, and we can unpack whether or not we agree that it's the opposite. But we're talking about divine punishment. The question of sort of how does the divine operate in terms of punishing humans for their sinful behavior. So, yeah.
Big.
It is really big. It is really big. And it has been a concern, certainly, of, sort of the monotheistic traditions for a long time, right? Millennia of sort of thinking through. And I was thinking about how in the Hebrew scriptures, sort of the Christian view of the Hebrew scriptures is that God, the God of those stories, is this punishing God full of retribution and wrath who destroys existence and floods and wants to raise Sodom and Gomorrah and all this sort of violent whatever. And then again, the Christian view is that then Jesus comes along and replaces this God that's sort of full of wrath with this God of love, right? Replaces the law with love, and everything becomes, and yet Christianity totally retains for a very long time this notion of punishment, right? After death punishment by God in hell. Well, I guess technically by Satan, but in hell. And then you get tons of stories that grow up and visions of what that looks like, right? With Dante, sort of the classic vision of retributive justice in these layers of hell. And so we're going to just talk about that. We're going to talk about what is God's role in punishment and how does that impact how we punish here on earth.
Yeah, and these things are so related, right? I mean, what we believe happens to us after death, and then how we treat each other here while we're alive. And I think that our theologies of the afterlife really define our theologies for our behavior now, so that you and I, as Unitarian Universalists, have this general expectation that everyone is loved and everyone is saved, and that after you die, that will be your experience, one of universal love. And so in life, we do everything we can to include more people and to help people to feel loved and forgiven and cared for and centered. And that is the way that our theology is made manifest. And I think that all of the different theologies we can sort of discern by the way people treat each other while they're alive.
I think that's right. I mean, we were talking about this before. I think that, yes, the vision that we have of God enables our conduct in the world, right? So if we believe in a God that punishes, punishment becomes okay, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that plays out. If we believe in a God that punishes for eternity, then we think eternal punishment, right, death penalty or life in prison or whatever is okay. If we believe in a God that doesn't believe in rehabilitation for everyone, then we are not going to think about rehabilitation, right? So I actually think we should start cards on the table as Unitarian Universalists, right? That second piece, universalism, means what you were just describing, that in theory, the God that we believe in is a God that we believe doesn't punish. Now, just because I think it's fascinating, I wanted to tell this to the world, and then we can sort of move out from there. But there were different kinds of universalism, right? There was ultra universalism, which literally said, the minute you die, God restores you to God's self because God is so loving and so powerful and can do that. And why wouldn't God do that? If God is a loving parent, why would God not gather you up in God's presence and make you whole, right? No matter who you were. And they meant it, like no matter who you were. And then there were the restorationists who were like, you're going to maybe spend like 5, 10, 50, 50,000 years in hell. And then God's going to bring you back after you've like done your time, right? But even there, it's really interesting to think about how that plays out, right? So if you're a restorationist, you can totally see how that could map onto like a legal system, a jail system, right? A prison system of you do your time and then you get wrapped back up into the love and into the care of society, right? You could also see an ultra universalist being like, there no prisons, right? Like let's only focus on rehabilitation. Let's only talk about how to keep people in community restored and given the tools they need, right? And then you come to people who believe in eternal punishment in the fiery pits of hell, and like it totally changes how you're willing to see the world and what you're willing to do to each other in it.
I think it's so much easier for us to believe in some kind of purgatory, in some in between space, because it means that there's the chance for everyone, right? That there's this sense of we love justice, right? We want to believe that people who are truly horrible will pay, and not that, not the prodigal son will not show up again and be loved and forgiven and given everything right off the bat. We want some kind of justice. And we understand ourselves to be imperfect. So we also want to know that while we would like justice for other people, we would like a little less justice for ourselves, and would like to know that we will be loved forever. So I think that we created this in between. I mean, I know why it was created historically, but aside from that, we have adopted this purgatory experience because it makes us feel better. Right? It's not an all or nothing. We don't have to choose. And the Universalists fell into that. So, on the one hand, they were inspired by this idea that everyone is saved, and that changed everything. And then, there's this sense of like, well, but what about Hitler? What
It
about
always
Russia? Right? And, right. I mean, that's always the argument. What about Hitler? And then you go, well, he'll have to take some time to come into himself and be restored to his full glory. And it could take, right, the Universalists ultimately were like 50,000 years. But there is this like desire for a system like that.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because then we get into the sort of psychology of humans and our need, like our sort of compulsion to judgment and to like, because I think, and I am like, this is like a new thought that's occurring to me as we speak, but I think that part of that fundamentally comes out of a, a sort of innate deep sense of questioning our own worth, right? In other words, if I actually felt 100% sure that I was loved no matter what, it would not inspire me to be bad in the world. That's not the impact it has, right? Like being loved doesn't make us do bad things. That's not how it works. If you have children, you know this, right? But if I was actually convinced of my own belovedness and everyone else's own belovedness, I'm not sure that we would feel that deep need for like justice and judgment and punishment for others, right? I don't know. Maybe that's wrong. I don't, when I was young, like I could hold a grudge. I am an Italian. Like you would not believe, right? And I don't know what changed. I don't know if it was process towards ministry. I don't know, right? But I don't anymore rejoice in the idea of other people's punishment. Honestly, in some ways, no matter what they've done. Not that I don't think punishment isn't useful and important, right? Like there should be consequences for actions. Maybe that's the point. Maybe there's a difference between punishment and consequence, right? Like punishment feels emotionally driven, like the sort of retribution question, and consequence feels like you did a thing and you have to pay the price for that thing that you did, and it's going to be determined by your peers and by your context, but that's somehow different.
So it's really almost a motivational thing. Like,
Yeah.
is the because if the consequence is human made, then the consequence is is it motivated by a sense of you need to account for what you did, or is it motivated by a desire for revenge?
Okay.
And I think we see that playing out in in our political system, in our all over the place.
So, okay, so I'm like taking us down a thread I didn't even realize I was going to take us down, but I want to like map punishment and like the distinction between punishment and consequence onto the distinction between shame and guilt, and then onto the distinction between like sinful or beloved, right? So if I line those up, punishment is a thing you get because you are fundamentally sinful and need to feel like shame about who you are. Consequences are a thing you get when you've done a bad thing, but you are loved enough for boundaries to be set. And you can totally tell this is like a parenting thing too, right? That like, because there is such a difference when you think about old, Amy, our producer, was talking about like sort of old fashioned punishments, right? Of like shunning, which still exist in lots of religious communities today, right? Shunning or public shaming. Those are about like tearing down a person's like fundamental self, right? Like shaming them for who they are, not having them like do what needs to be done to make good on what bad thing, right? So like it's in there's a lot more wrapped up in this than I even realized.
Well, and there's also for me this sense of where does redemption come in? At
Yeah.
at what point at what point do we forgive, or at what point has someone accounted for their behavior well enough that the rest of us feel that we are back in right relationship? And, and this question of self-worth, I mean, you're, you're sort of opening up for me all these questions about how much we project our own self-worth onto other people, and how much we live with our own shame and then project our shame and then require other people to pay for our shame. I mean, right, this is a rabbit hole.
Yes, it is, but it's a really fascinating one, right? And but it all comes back to how you view God, right? So, in other words, if I view God as like a loving parent, right? This is the Universalist, right? God is the loving parent of all existence. Then that parent is not going to deny our redemption, right? Is not going to the loving parent is not going to shun us for all eternity. um and so that question of redemption, well, and we also get, Universalists would have said there's nothing to be redeemed from, in a way, right? Like that humans are not fundamentally evil and flawed, and don't need the kind of redemption that Catholicism would have said they needed, right? Or Orthodox Christianity.
Well,
um
not from original sin, right? Not
yeah.
fundamentally, but certainly in terms of our behavior, that our behavior requires accountability.
Yeah, but again, we come back to this question of accountability versus punishment. And I think that part of that is, what is the outcome, right? If we're punishing in order to deter behavior, right? That's like one thing. If we're punishing in order to create a lasting marker of difference between the evil and the good, that's another thing. If we're punishing or offering consequences in order to rehabilitate, that's another thing, right? And in fairness, our sort of American Western model is one that mimics the I think is one that mimics most closely a vision of God that is retributive, shaming, isolating, disconnecting, as opposed to a vision of God that is a sort of loving attempt to redeem and bring back, right?
So if we believe that God loves us irreversibly
Mhm.
and absolutely, does that love alter behavior? Like, in other words, if I have a child who, right, I completely love my child, don't want to see my child punished, and yet every once in a while we'll do something he shouldn't do, and there has to be a consequence for that. If But it's easy for me to love him. Does my loving him then change the next time? I mean, my experience so far with raising a child is yes, right? That we are in this love relationship, and actually, when he realizes that something wasn't okay, he doesn't do it the next time. Right? That love does actually change. It did alter the behavior. So, is it? Are we suggesting that people would behave differently if they believed that they were universally, irreversibly loved? Would we have a very different society if we were to let go of the entire idea, really, of hell and divine retribution?
Yes. My short answer is yes. No, I really do think so. And look, obviously everybody having some deep and abiding sense of their own belovedness is not going to like end poverty and oppression, except maybe it would, right? Like, because once you have some deep and abiding sense of your own belovedness, the need for competition goes away. I have a relative who I once heard essentially say, like, I hope that, this other relative of ours doesn't use up all their love on this set of children because I want my children to be loved, as if love were like a limited resource and we had to compete for it, right? As if there was some fundamental way and only some amount of us could be okay and everyone else has to be bad. And if you can push, and I think it's natural human sort of tribal scarcity, whatever mentality, but if all of us could push past that into a place where like love wasn't a finite resource and shame was not something we felt inherently, right? And a sense of belonging was all of ours, right? All of a sudden you don't, all the stuff, all the money, all the, I don't know, I feel maybe naively, I feel like it would actually improve human interaction and human existence if people could live out of that place. That said, it's really, really hard. Um, it's really hard to know that you are loved and really feel that actively all the time. And it's really hard to feel that about other people, right? It's really easy to feel that sort of self-righteous justice judgment thing.
I'm kind of being reminded of the balance between justice and mercy. So,
Mhm.
as someone who has supervised people and has been supervised by other people, I, I remember a long time ago having a boss and saying to someone, he chooses mercy over justice, and I don't know if I like it because someone in the office was behaving really inappropriately, and I was like, there has to be, like, you have to say this isn't okay, and instead he was being really gentle and kind about the whole thing. But it has defined for me so many relationships, like recognizing that in him and in that moment, and then moving forward and trying to find this balance. And I think that we all want to receive mercy and we all want to witness justice. And there's a way in which we have to extend ourselves. If we want to receive mercy, we also have to extend mercy, and we have to be willing to recognize that all people are redeemable, and that every situation, that we are in every case, can be moved toward the more loving response, that we can be embraced by a love that can transform us, that we are, in fact, currently embraced by a love trying to transform us.
I love um, this question about justice and mercy. So, and I think you're right. I think for most people, we want mercy for ourselves and justice for others. And again, I mean, I have to confess, I don't feel that strongly at the moment. However, here's when it gets activated. Be really honest. It gets activated when mercy is applied to white men and to no one else, that like gets my blood going, right? Like, because I think that's part of it too. And so maybe it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? Where like it would be easy to sort of err on the side of mercy if mercy was equally applied, if mercy was extended to all, right? If mercy was the way that we live, right? But the way that we live is actually hard ass justice on people of color, on women, right? Like that we live in a totally um unfair and oppressive vision of justice versus mercy. um
I'm not sure I would even call that justice, though. I mean, I think that we live in a system, in a really broken and oppressive system, and and that and I guess in moments of like someone gets pulled over. I mean, how many times has this happened, right? A black man is killed, and how many white people go to, well, but he was doing X, and he was selling loose cigarettes, but he'd been a criminal for, he was arrested 10 years before, but right, so that suddenly justice becomes, necessary and violent, and karma is inevitable in some horrific way. Whereas if a white person does exactly the same thing, then it's all about mercy. Then, like, then what, and it was a white woman. I mean, then what was she doing? She was selling some loose cigarettes to feed her kids. Of course we have mercy.
so I want to tell you a story, and in my mind it fits, so like give me a second to sort of. So I when I was in grad school doing my divinity degree, I had a good friend who had grown up extremely like speaking in tongues fundamentalist Christian, right? Like I think snakes may have even been involved on occasion, right? Like I'm not joking, like very seriously. And I was visiting with her and her fiance once, and I asked them, I was like, I don't like, how do you understand um LGBTQ and punishment and God and all of this? And the fiance was like, going to hell, full stop, no questions, that's it. And my friend was like, I don't presume to know what God, and this was a friend who had loads of LGBTQ friends, right? Like, which is the fascinating mental gymnastics that people do, right? But her answer was, I don't presume to know God's will, right? I don't presume to, I'm agnostic, which I object to, frankly, but in her case, she was agnostic to sort of the question of what God was going to do with LGBTQ folks, right? Now, I raise this because I think what it illustrates for me is that she had an understanding of the human limitations, right? Which is part of what you're pointing to, is that it's not justice, it's a misapplication of justice because of human limitations and a human like development and commitment to an oppressive racist system, right? Like, in other words, I'm wondering, like, what would it look like if everyone was just like, it's not ours to decide? It would probably be worse too. I don't know. But, like, in other words, when we're thinking about divine punishment, if we were like, it's God's to punish, not ours, what impact would that have? Right? Because I don't think that is the vision. Right now, the vision is like, exactly, I am the hand of God, like acting on earth, doing God's will and punishing you, abortion clinic people, or you black men for selling cigarettes or whatever, right? Like, I don't know.
Well, it's how you justify the death penalty. Like, right, that we are acting on behalf of God. So I think that that would be a step up for a lot of people to say it's not mine to judge, and not, this is for God, and I'm letting this go. Um, so for that's an improvement. I would hope that we could go further than that, and start talking about, like, actually, I fully embrace you because you are a child of God, because you are so fully and completely loved. I embrace and welcome you, and will make room for you in my life, in my church, my workplace, my in society, that you belong fully and completely for who you are.
Yeah. Well, and that's where it comes back to. This is why I think it was important to sort of think about divine and love and divine and punishment kind of like together, because I don't think you can separate out how you understand God's love and how you understand God's boundaries or punishment, right? And that's, for me, that's sort of a, again, out of parenting, right? This is the distinction between like punishment and boundaries, because nobody thrives on total chaos, right? So it wouldn't make sense to have a society where literally anything could happen and nobody said or did anything about it, right? There have to be structures and systems, but they don't have to be structures and systems that cause a lifetime of separation, right? Or a lifetime of disconnection from the rest of society. Um, and that's where, like, oh, go ahead.
Well, I just think right, I agree, there's no way to separate divine love and divine punishment. Uh, Thinking about this, experiences I've had of forgiving people, and there is something around, like not being able to deny love. Think about this woman, and this woman was one of my closest friends, and then she and my boyfriend then started sleeping together, and so I lost my boyfriend and my best friend, and I hated passionately this woman, and he and I ended up sort of okay, but she and I not at all. So I was invited to this thing where she was speaking, and God, I was dreading it, but I had no way to not go. So I go and I'm sitting in the front row, and now she gets up, right? And I'm like, I did not want to see her being beautiful, looking fabulous, having everyone sort of adoring her. And just, I was like, oh, I can't believe I've said this. She gets up and she leans. Well, as she starts walking, I remember how much she hated public speaking and realized, and I could feel her anxiety as she moved past me. And I was in the front row, of course. And then she leans on this blackboard that was on wheels, and it shot out from under her. And the look on her face, and all I could feel for her was love, overwhelming love. I just thought, oh my God, I, it was beyond thought. It was really like just this feeling for her while other people were laughing at her. And there's something about like when you tap into that love, the anger and the hate just go away. And when I think of God as being grounded in that love, that God exists entirely of that, then redemption, forgiveness, mercy make complete sense to me. I can't really imagine anything else.
Yeah,
So
that
the rest of it feels like just a system we create when we get angry, right?
right. And I, for me, again, that comes back to human limitation, right? That I refuse to put my vision of God into the boxes that humans fit, right? In other words, I am not able to forgive super easily or to live in that love all the time, but sure as heck you better believe God could, right? So like that, I think that um understanding that at the same time that we embody the holy and we participate in the holy and that we are ourselves divine in some sense, that there's something beyond us. And it's, we talked last week about that feeling that you sometimes get, right? When you look for it and you try that feeling of just like, it is all one and we're all sort of a piece. And that, if that feeling is what God is, right? This is what I tell my children God is. If that's what God is, right? The feeling like when you're being held by your mom and you just feel really safe or whatever, then all of a sudden everything changes. And our aspirations change. Right?
The challenge for us, I think, the massive spiritual challenge is dismantling the systems that that benefit justice over mercy and that prioritize retribution and punishment over love.
Yeah.
And that is it seems like that's the work of our church, is the I think it's the religious work of our time.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's get to work.
I know. It's like, ah,
You first.
it's so big. It's so big. No, it's true. Yeah. Yeah. Just center the love, the rehabilitation, the forgiveness. Yeah, it's easy to say, but yes. But
So
yes.
we're coming to the end of our time. This has been a really good conversation. We're gonna have a great season. We've got like to keep talking about what God is and who God is and how we experience and manifest that in the world. This is good work.
I'm excited.
All right, see you next week.
Talk to you soon.